people become very attached to their way of eating, and especially when they believe that it's the one and only way to eat healthfully, it can be very difficult to hear that, I think I said this before, that that's not true, that there are other ways of eating that are okay too. And so I think that it becomes just easier to attach some stigma to that other way of eating.
Welcome to the Proof Podcast, a space for science-based conversation exploring the health and longevity benefits that come with mastering nutrition, physical exercise, mindfulness, recovery, sleep, and alignment. Facts, nuance, and trustworthy recommendations, minus the hyperbole. Hi friends, great to be here with you. I'm your host, Simon Hill. I'm a qualified physiotherapist and nutritionist with an undergraduate science degree and a master's in the science of human nutrition. Today I sit down with registered dietitian and vegan nutrition guru, Ginny Messina, known as Ginny Messina to many, to talk about myths within the vegan community. Are humans obligate herbivores? Is cheese physically addictive? Is seafood unhealthy due to mercury? Is methylcobalamin the best form of vitamin B12? Do oils raise the risk of heart disease? Is dairy inflammatory? Ginny and I explore each of these questions and more in what I believe is a really informative and important episode for everyone, but particularly those in the plant-based community. Discussing this stuff is not about weakening the message. In fact, it's the opposite. A vegan diet based on whole plant foods can be extremely health promoting. It doesn't have to be exaggerated and need not be a panacea for it to be a way of eating that is worthy of consideration. And if you've read my book, you'll know that's the case that I make. There's a clear theme or set of dietary characteristics that time and time again lead to humans experiencing better health for longer. This theme is naturally achieved by plant-predominant to exclusive diets based on whole or minimally processed foods. Michael Pollan summarized it well when he said, "Eat food, mostly plants, not too much." When you then also consider the environment and animals we share Earth with, a very strong case can be made to adopt a diet that's as plant-exclusive as possible for the individual. So that's the context for today's episode. Please do enjoy. This is me and registered dietitian, Ginny Messina. Hi, Ginny. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much. It's so great to finally meet you outside of social media. It's great to see you, Simon.
I know. We've exchanged a few messages over the years and I've learned, I have to say, so much from your work. So I wanted to just quickly say thank you. When I think of the registered dietitians out there that have inspired me and also the ones that I recommend, I always think about you and Jack Norris and Brenda Davis. So thank you for all the incredible work that you've done.
Oh, thank you for that.
So today we've chosen to focus on addressing some of the major nutrition myths within the vegan community. I thought perhaps though we could start with you personally and why you're personally vegan. I know that you didn't adopt a vegan diet until a decade or so after you became a registered dietitian, if I'm right. Can you kind of share that story? How did that come about?
Yeah, I did. I actually did become vegan just about the time that I was becoming a registered dietitian, but not throughout my education. When I was in college and graduate school, I was not vegetarian. I wasn't really thinking about it. So it's been a journey. It's been an evolution. I started out going to college to study social work. That's what I thought that I was going to do with my life, and found myself very surprised that I enjoyed the science classes that I had to take as part of a just general liberal arts education. There were science classes that were requirements, and I loved them. And so I started gravitating towards nutrition and especially public health nutrition, and just kind of went in that direction and decided to become a dietitian. I wasn't really thinking about vegetarianism. I have had a heart for animals all my life, but I just did not make that connection until I really started studying food and nutrition and thinking about food choices. And that's when it started to occur to me that my relationship to animals, my considerations about animals really did have something to do with my food choices. And so I did adopt a vegetarian diet just about the time, just at the end of graduate school when I became a registered dietitian. And it was kind of great because I had all all kinds of different jobs when I first started in this field. I worked at a couple of universities. I taught dietetic students. I worked in public health clinics. And because I was a vegetarian, I developed this reputation as sort of the de facto expert on vegetarian nutrition. So if somebody needed a guest lecture or they needed, educational materials developed, that always fell to me. So I got to work in this field, even though I didn't really have a job that was dedicated to plant-based nutrition. And there weren't very many people who were interested in vegetarian nutrition at that time. So I had lots of opportunities.
Do you remember when you were first thinking about adopting a vegetarian diet? And the way I'm thinking about this is that over the years it progressed, people like yourself and Brenda Davis and others have really put out so much incredible information that's made it easier for people to do that transition and make those changes and feel confident about doing it in a manner that's good for their health. But I'm curious, for yourself, do you recall what resources, where were you going to discover the information that you needed to know that it was possible that you could do that, remove the animal foods from your diet and do it in a way that's healthy?
Yeah, there weren't very many resources for that. There were some resources from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because vegetarianism has been a part of that culture and that community for such a long time. The Vegetarian Resource Group in Baltimore was around at that time, and that was another organization that was providing some information. But I was actually getting a lot of information from cookbooks. I was reading Laurel's Kitchen, which was a cookbook. And I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's a very old-timey kind of hippie cookbook that was published in the 1970s and was also a handbook on nutrition. Lots of misinformation based on what we know now, but those were the kinds of resources I was using. And then, of course, because I was a dietitian and because I was studying this area, I was reading what peer-reviewed literature existed. I was reading that and getting information about plant-based diets.
And do you recall what the sort of general feeling was around you from friends and family as you were making these changes? Was it something that you were sharing and communicating with others? Were you going about it privately? And at that time, was it something that society was accepting as something that could be healthy?
I think that people definitely accepted it as something that could be healthy. That was the main reason that the main thing that people talked about when they talked about a vegetarian diet, that it was a healthier way of eating. I was very open about the fact that I was a vegetarian in my career because, for one thing, because I wanted these opportunities. I wanted people to know that I was a resource. When I was teaching at Central Michigan University, I wanted my students to know about vegetarian nutrition. And so it was definitely something that I was talking about. It's a little bit harder with my family. They were absolutely horrified that anyone in our family would stop eating meat. That was such a part of my culture, of my upbringing, as it was for many of us. So the personal stuff was harder than the professional.
Right. And today, how do you kind of like people to think about a vegan diet when you think about its role in animal welfare, human health, etc.? How would you kind of describe the rationale for adopting a vegan diet? Why you think it's a good choice for people to be thinking about?
I am very committed to veganism as a component of animal rights, as an expression of animal rights. It is my number one reason for eating this way. It's really my only reason for eating this way. And I'm very upfront about that because I think it's extremely important to be transparent about my reasons for adopting a vegan diet. I have a big bias about this. I think that people should not eat animals. And I need colleagues and clients and anybody who is working with me to know that. And I also want people to know, of course, that this is a compelling reason to stop eating animal products. I think that there's a really good health argument for reducing animal products in your diet, for eating a vegetarian diet. when it comes to veganism, I think that we have to bring the animal rights message in because that is the compelling reason for being a vegan.
And I know we're going to jump into a bunch of different myths, and we've kind of organized those into a list. But I guess just broadly speaking, what do you think is the sort of reason why there is misinformation within the vegan community when it comes to nutrition? Is it about trying to make the vegan diet seem better than it is, and the intention is a good one in that will help more people adopt this diet? When you just think about the sort of misinformation that no doubt you've seen over decades, and I want to ask you as to whether you think that's getting better or worse, but what do you think is the kind of the root cause, or where most of this misinformation is stemming from?
I think that there are a couple of different reasons why we see so much misinformation in the vegan community, and of course, it's not just the vegan community.
Sure.
We both know, of course, that it's all different kinds of diets and all different kinds of beliefs about the best way to eat. There's always going to be some mythology about these different approaches. With veganism, I think it's very much as you said, that people who are devoted to animal rights and to animal welfare and animal protection want to see as many people as possible go vegan, and therefore it's really there's tremendous pull towards promoting veganism or displaying veganism as something that is foolproof and is going to automatically make you healthy, automatically make you skinny. People want to present a very positive message about veganism because they want more people to go vegan, and I completely respect that. I respect the fact that people feel so strongly about this. I don't think it's the right way to go about promoting veganism, but I understand it. And then I think that there's another group of people who truly believe that a vegan diet is the only diet that's going to protect their health.
Right.
And I think that sometimes it's easy to be resistant to information that runs counter to that. It's a little scary. It's a little frightening when you have adopted this diet that you are so sure is the perfect diet, to hear information that counters that. That can be a little bit threatening to your choice and to what you believe about what you're doing.
So on that second one, where someone really truly believes that a diet without any animal products has been proven to be the single most optimal diet for human health, where does that come from?
I think it comes from wanting to believe that there is a perfect diet. There's something that's for people who are able to change their food habits, to change their lifestyle habits. There is something very reassuring about believing that the food choices that you're making are not only ideal, but foolproof, that they're going to guarantee that you have good health.
And you sort of alluded to the fact that this misinformation exists in many different diet camps, and a parallel could be drawn to, for example, in the low-carb community, where someone has had a good personal experience with a low-carb diet, and then you'll see them advocating that as the single only diet for human health. And so I think here as well, the sort of getting lost in your own anecdote can also sort of give rise to this idea that this is therefore the way that every single person should eat, the only way that people should eat for optimal health. What do you think the repercussions are? So we've kind of established that some of this misinformation, the intent behind it is actually good. There is good intent. And so what I'm curious to kind of hear from you on, for someone who may have been caught up in some of this information and thinks that, ultimately it's for the greater good, even if the information's not completely accurate. What are the downsides? What are the risks? What are the repercussions of sharing information that is not accurate?
Well, I think that the most important repercussion is that people can end up being unhealthy. They can end up with nutrient deficiencies. I came into this field of veganism. My first job working specifically with plant-based diets, with vegan diets, was with Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, PCRM, in Washington, D.C. And that was my first exposure to. I was a vegetarian already, but it was my first exposure to veganism, to health aspects of veganism, to animal rights. It really just opened my eyes to so many different things. It was life-changing for me. But my job at PCRM really was to promote the health benefits of a vegan diet. And as I learned more about veganism and started reading the research and started looking at diet planning as it related to vegan diets, I started to become very concerned about the fact that we as plant-based health professionals were not giving people enough information about meeting nutrient needs. Mm-hmm. And I was seeing this is an experience that I share with Jack Norris. It's the reason that we wrote our book, Vegan for Life. We wanted to tackle this problem. We were concerned about the problem. There it is.
Yes, yes.
We were concerned that people were failing on a vegan diet. And we didn't believe that there was any reason for that. Didn't believe that there was anything inherently wrong with the vegan diet. People just did not have the information that they needed. So that's what happens when people buy into mythology or simply don't have the information. Their health fails, and they become ex-vegans, and that's just not good for anybody. So I think that's the big repercussion from this misinformation that pervades the vegan community.
Right. And so you've been doing this for a fair while now. Mm-hmm. How do you think the vegan community is going, both, I guess, at the individual level, but also at the level of some of these advocacy groups? You just mentioned PCRM there. How do you think, as a collective, we're going in terms of setting the record straight and delivering high-quality information versus spreading misinformation where perhaps there's good intent, but at the end of the day, the information's not completely accurate or whole?
Yeah, I think we're all over the place for the same reasons that advocates for other dietary patterns are kind of all over the place. I think we have some advocates for plant-based diets, for whole foods plant-based diets in particular, who health professionals who have kind of built their career on a particular dietary philosophy. And it's difficult to change what you're saying and even what you believe when you've built your career around something. And we have other health professionals who are advocating a vegan diet as the only healthy way to eat because they really want people to go vegan to save animals. And then there are lots of non-health professional vegans who are listening to these two groups and getting this information and believing this information. But at the same time, what has really changed for me, what has been just extraordinary, it's been so wonderful, is seeing this growing group of vegan health professionals, of plant-based health professionals who are like you, who are absolutely committed to sharing good information, even when it's information that vegans don't want to hear. And we see this growing group of dietitians and doctors who are doing this, and researchers who are doing it. And also among non-health professionals, there is a group of savvy people who are speaking out on behalf of good evidence-based vegan nutrition and not being fearful about saying things that are unpopular. 20 years ago, there were really very few of us saying things that were unpopular, and it was really lonely. So it's much better now.
Yes, I can certainly agree with a lot of that. And on the sort of idea of things that vegans don't want to hear, I think this comes back, and I just want to kind of reinforce this as we go through this list of myths, that the intent here with us to go through this is not to kind of pick on a community or certain messages. It is to really emphasize that setting the record straight on these things is actually the path forward to achieving a greater outcome, even though it may not seem that way. So we have this list, Ginny, that we've created and sort of put into a little bit of an order, and thank you to those on Twitter who engaged in a tweet that I did and brought forward a few suggestions. So perhaps we sort of just step through these from the top, and I think as we go through these, Ginny, we'll start to really see the way that you approach vegan nutrition and the way that you're communicating, which is probably the going to be the greatest takeaway for everyone that's tuning in. So the first one is a diet based on a variety of whole plant foods will guarantee that all nutrient needs are met. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that that belief is kind of the reason that I've stuck with this field, that I've stayed here and continued to do what I've been doing for all these decades. People have bought into this idea that as long as you're eating fruits and vegetables and grains and legumes and nuts, that you're automatically going to meet nutrient needs. I like to remind people that it is not difficult to meet nutrient needs on a vegan diet, but it is not intuitive either. You do have to know something. Cow's milk is not the only source of calcium, but for most people, it's the only source they've ever known about. Mm-hmm. And so when you stop drinking cow's milk, you absolutely have to know where you're going to get calcium. It might just happen based by luck through your food choices, but for most people, it's not. You got to know what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So that's it's a crucial issue because it's, again, I don't want people to think that this is some big laborious task, learning about all of these nutrients and how you meet nutrient needs. It's not at all. It really is not that difficult, but you have to spend a little bit of time learning just a few things.
And on that, in your book, you actually make a point about, so in the position statement about vegan diet, it says that wording of appropriately planned. And you kind of elaborated on that. Can you just share what you feel about that? And I thought you made some interesting points there about really that being relevant to any diet.
Well, it is, and of course that appropriately planned clause is just a thorn in the side of so many vegan and vegetarian dietitians, because any diet has to be appropriately planned. There are lots of people consuming dairy products and eggs and meat who are not meeting nutrient needs because their diets aren't appropriately planned. Mm-hmm. So it's it's just kind of a silly clause. It doesn't make any sense. Any diet has to be well planned in order to meet nutrient needs.
Okay, myth number 2. Humans are obligate herbivores. This one's a good one.
Yeah, so we've all seen those. We've all seen those charts showing teeth and jaws and digestive system, the intestine length, and it makes for a very compelling argument, but it's just not true. I mean, we know that our ancestors have been, consuming animal foods for eons. We know that humans evolved as omnivores, that our intestines are kind of somewhere between a carnivore and an herbivore. And, the fortunate thing is that we are omnivores who can eat an herbivorous diet. We can eat a vegan diet. So to me, that's enough to know. I don't think that we need this. Again, this goes back to proving that a vegan diet is the only healthy way to eat. That's not true. Trying to prove that we are supposed to eat a vegan diet, that we evolved to do that. It's not true. And it's just not helpful to promote either of those beliefs. All we really need to know is that we can eat a vegan diet and be healthy. Mm-hmm.
We have the choice. Mm-hmm. Number 3, a vegan diet is the only healthy way to eat. We've kind of covered that, but was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just I wish that it were true. Maybe it's true. I don't know. I don't think that we have enough evidence to say that it's the only healthy way to eat. And I think that it's unlikely. I think that it's highly unlikely that including small amounts of animal foods in your diet is going to be detrimental to your health if your diet overall is low in saturated fat, high in fiber, nutrient rich, you're getting lots of potassium and calcium and just eating a generally good diet. If you're having a serving of cheese and a little bit of fish every day, I don't think that's going to make or break your health. Mm-hmm. And and it's a belief that a lot of people can't. They're really unhappy when I say that. But to me, it just always comes back to the fact that we have to advocate for veganism on the basis of animal protection, because that's something that we know. We know that production of all animal foods is harmful to animals. We can't prove anything about diet. We can't prove that a vegan diet is the only healthy way to eat.
Number 4, and this comes back to this idea of planning and learning a few new things about food as you're changing your diet. Vegans don't need to pay attention to protein. It's impossible to get too little. What do you think about that?
Well, of course, it is possible to get too little protein. It's certainly possible for older vegans to get too little protein. I think there's good evidence that protein needs increase as people age. We know that vegan diets are lower in protein than omnivore diets. So I think that as people get older, there is a real risk of not getting enough protein. I don't think that there's a terrible risk of not getting enough protein for younger vegans, for vegans in their 20s and 30s and 40s. I think most vegans are going to get enough protein, but it is possible to fall short. And in particular, if someone is not including legumes in their diet, at least 2 servings, hopefully 3 servings of legumes is what I really like to recommend. It's possible to fall short on protein. It's possible to fall short on some of the amino acids. So, just because we don't see vegans walking around with kwashiorkor doesn't mean that all vegans are getting enough protein. You can have moderate protein deficiency that takes a toll on immunity and muscle strength. You wouldn't see that as a protein deficiency, but it's a protein inadequacy.
Got a couple of follow-up questions on that. So if someone is, considered elderly, they're in the later years of life, do you have any strategies or tips for them to help increase their protein intake during that time?
Yeah, I think it's a little tricky because calorie needs tend to go down as people get older. Now we're talking really about people in their 70s and 80s, but calorie needs go down, protein needs probably go up. So you do have to really put some emphasis on eating protein-rich foods. I generally recommend that people replace some of the grains in their diet with legumes so that you're not eating more calories, but you are eating more beans and soy foods. And to replace fruits with vegetables, since fruits are pretty much devoid of protein and vegetables at least have some. But it's definitely something that takes some thought and takes some effort.
And I think I might be kind of jumping into territory of a further myth, but what are your thoughts on more processed sources of protein that perhaps are offering more protein for less calories, like soy protein isolate or pea protein isolate, or some of the plant-based alternative meat products?
Yeah, I think they're just great. I think that obviously, I want people to be eating lots of fiber-rich foods and foods that are packed with nutrients. But some of these high-protein foods, these more processed protein foods, can really help people who are not meeting protein needs or who are worried about meeting protein needs. Again, elderly people, people who are on weight loss diets because protein needs go up a little bit when you're losing weight. I just think that these foods can play a great role. I use protein powders. I use a protein powder after I weight lift, and I don't know if it does anything, but it somehow it feels like a really good thing to do. And I don't think that it's unhealthy. I'm not worried about having those foods in my diet. I don't want to see people eating veggie meats all the time because they're high in sodium. And so that's a little bit of an issue for me. But other than that, I think those foods are great.
So on that, if someone's, say, turning a veggie meat plant-based alternative, the label over and looking at it, is there a kind of amount of sodium that you would say, well, that gets a tick, that's pretty good, but if it's over this amount, it's probably one that you want to eat a little less frequently?
Oh, I think all of the veggie meats are actually quite high in sodium. So I think it's really just a matter of if you're watching sodium intake of limiting them in your diet, not having them every day.
Okay. Number 5, vegans have lower calcium needs because their diets are lower in protein.
Yeah, you know, I would think that this myth would go away by now. It's been around for a long, long time, probably 30 years or so. And there are reasons to believe that this is true, that high protein diets cause calcium to be leached out of the bones, because higher protein intake, especially from grains and animal foods, can create a more acidic condition, and the bones are active in countering that condition and buffering the acid. And as part of that process, some of calcium is released from the bones. So there's a logical explanation for this. There's a logical reason to believe that people who consume less protein or are not eating a lot of animal protein, that they're going to have lower calcium needs. But what we see from the research is that, first of all, that protein is probably very effective in increasing calcium absorption. And one school of thought, based on some good research, is that the calcium that's being released from the body, that's being released in the urine, is actually a byproduct of this higher calcium absorption. So it might not have anything to do with bone turnover whatsoever. And we know in general that protein is good for bones, that higher protein diets are associated with better bone health. So we haven't seen any real evidence that vegans can get away with lower calcium intakes. I do advise vegans to get plenty of calcium until we know otherwise. I think it's really important. I don't necessarily recommend concentrating on the RDA, because I think that calcium absorption is the much bigger issue. You want to choose foods with good calcium bioavailability. So I encourage vegans to eat plenty of calcium set tofu, calcium fortified plant milks, and the leafy green cruciferous vegetables.
Mm-hmm. And just in terms of building strong bones, do you have any other tips, I guess, outside of meeting calcium needs, consuming adequate amounts of protein? What else should folks be thinking about?
Yeah, calcium, protein, lots of fruits and vegetables. There's some evidence that diets high in fruits and vegetables are good for bone health. And exercise, which is by far the most important thing. Being physically active is the most important thing for bone health, of course.
Mm-hmm. And what about this idea that you need dairy for building strong bones?
Well, there's certainly no evidence for it. There's no evidence that people who consume dairy products have stronger bones. There's no reason why they would, because, you know, when we look at dairy products, we say, yeah, you know, they're great for bone health. They have calcium and vitamin D and protein, but we can get all of those things from plants. Well, we can get protein and calcium from plants, and we can get vitamin D through fortification, which is the same way that cow's milk provides vitamin D, because it's fortified, at least in the US. So there's nothing unique about milk when it comes to bone health. Anything that we need for bone health, we can get from other foods.
That brings us to myth number 6, which is about dairy. And this is one that I see quite a lot. And I think there's a lot of confusion here. Dairy foods cause inflammation, mucus production, and cancer.
Yeah, you know, I always get myself into a lot of trouble with the dairy issue, because I find myself in this situation all the time where I'm defending dairy foods, and I don't want to defend dairy. I think it's a horrible industry. Again, there's no reason to include it in your diet, and it's just it's bad for the environment. It's horrible for the animals. But it's pretty hard to make the case against dairy based on health. The research doesn't show that it causes inflammation. The research is a little bit conflicting, but it probably has just the opposite effect, although it's probably a very tiny effect. It probably doesn't really make much difference to inflammation one way or the other. It definitely has not been shown to increase mucus production, except in people who have dairy allergies. And if you have a dairy allergy, you don't want to be eating dairy anyway. And then the cancer issue is a little stickier, because of the evidence about dairy foods and prostate cancer. We have evidence from the epidemiological from the epidemiological research, there is reason to believe that men who have high intakes of dairy foods have a higher risk of prostate cancer. So I don't, it hasn't been proven. It hasn't been proven as a cause and effect relationship, but I do think that it's something to pay attention to. I don't think that dairy has been associated with other types of cancer to any compelling degree.
Right.
For breast cancer, it's kind of conflicting. For colon cancer, it seems to be protective.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big story where it's a little bit difficult to draw some conclusions. But I do think that men should limit their dairy intake, and get calcium and vitamin D from fortified plant milks. And that was the message from the latest Adventist Health study that looked at dairy food. I think it was published just early this month, and it looked at dairy foods and prostate cancer. And that was the message from those researchers. If you're concerned about prostate cancer, drink plant milks.
Coming back to the myth, so if someone stumbles across something that's suggesting dairy is poison or outright causes cancer, you're saying that this is not supported by science, bit of an exaggeration, and perhaps not giving the full picture of what we see when we look at studies looking at dairy.
Yeah, I think that it is. I think that it's not very well supported by the research.
Yeah, that fact that there is the opposite association for colorectal cancer, where dairy may be protective. That one doesn't seem to get as much airtime, which I always find quite interesting.
Right, and it's a fairly strong relationship, I believe.
Do you think that's something inherent about dairy, other than the kind of nutrients that you mentioned before, or do you think it's things like calcium, for example?
I think it's probably calcium. I think that's at least one of the theories.
Okay, number 7 is continuing on this dairy theme. Cheese is physically addictive. And this, I think, leads back to the sort of casomorphins discussion.
Yeah, it's about the casomorphine, the casein in cheese that can be converted to casomorphine, which does attach to dopamine receptors. I mean, that's a true thing. There's that physiology is there. The question is whether it ever makes it out of the intestines to get to those receptors. Does it attach to them in quantities or in ways that actually have a real effect? That actually makes cheese addictive. I don't think that there's any evidence. We hear the news stories about it, which it's the news, so it exaggerates things, and that's understandable. We hear, that it's like crack. It's as bad as crack. Cheese is as bad as crack for your brain. And that's just not true. It doesn't have nearly that effect. There's certainly no evidence that it does. I really think that the big thing about cheese, and it is true that people say, oh, I would go vegan. I just can't imagine giving up cheese. It's really difficult for people to give up cheese because cheese has fat and it has salt and aged cheeses have umami, which is a very compelling essence of foods, something that people want. Breast milk has umami. That's one of the theories about the advantages of it, that babies will drink more of it and grow better because it has umami. So I think that that's the explanation for cheese. I think that if you make a great nut cheese with nutritional yeast in it that also has lots of umami, that is as compelling and addictive as cow's milk cheese.
Number 8 is seafood is unhealthy due to its mercury content. So this one I come across quite a lot if I sort of convey what the research shows about fish in general and conveyed in what I think is an honest representation of the science that we have. Often I'm met with, but there's mercury, there's high levels of mercury. So what do you think about this idea that seafood should be avoided due to its mercury content, and that mercury content makes it an unhealthy food to consume?
Yeah, this is another issue that is difficult because certainly there is mercury in seafood, in fish. And that is something that we would want to avoid. Many health professionals believe that the benefits of consuming fish outweigh any risks. And so for that to be true, then we have to know that there are specific benefits of consuming fish, DHA and EPA, the omega-3 fatty acids, of course. And I'm not convinced that we know for a fact that there's any particular advantage to consuming these foods. Again, the research is pretty conflicting when it comes to this issue. But if that were true, and again, it may be. Again, I'm not saying it's not. I simply don't know. If it is true, there are certainly types of fish that are much lower in mercury. If you avoid the large predator fish and eat the small fish that aren't predators, you're not going to get very much mercury. And those are the kinds of fish that are recommended for pregnant women, for example, because they're pretty safe. Mm-hmm. For me, this always comes back to this idea that when we consume animal foods, if people choose to consume animal foods, when you make the healthiest choices, you might do better for your body, but you end up doing more harm to animals. Because if we want to eat fish and avoid mercury, we're going to eat small fish. And that means we're going to eat more fish. So more fish get killed and eaten. It's the same thing, people say, well, I eat meat, but I want to have a really healthy diet, so I don't eat red meat. I only eat chicken meat. And again, you end up eating more chickens, killing more chickens because they're smaller animals. So I think that you can have fish in a diet that is healthy. I think that it causes people to make some very unfortunate decisions that are really, really bad for animal welfare. So I guess the answer to that question is that I think that you can healthfully eat some kinds of fish. I really hope that people won't do it because it's really bad for the fish.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, and I always find this an interesting conversation about bivalves, so oysters and, say, mussels and scallops. If someone was, say, eating seafood, but they were met with this kind of ethical dilemma about eating sardines and salmon and mackerel, seafood that we clearly know is sentient. What do you feel, or do you have any thoughts about the consumption of bivalves? Particularly what I see online and in certain conversations is farmed bivalves where there's no bycatch and potentially some benefit for the environment.
I would not do it myself. Eating bivalves does not feel like a good fit to my perception of ethical veganism, but I'm not completely convinced of the harm that it causes. I'm not completely convinced that bivalves really have any sense of fear or pain when they're processed. So if somebody else wants to eat these, it's not a hill I'm going to die on. I'm not going to say to them, "Oh no, you shouldn't be eating scallops. You shouldn't do that. It's really bad for the animals." I'm not going to waste time on that. So I think it's a really interesting question. I wish we knew more about it. I am not prepared to eat bivalves at this point myself, but if someone else feels like it is okay to do, I can't really argue with them about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, moving on to number 9. A low-fat, plant-based diet is the optimal vegan diet. So here we're talking about the amount of fat within a whole food plant-based diet. And I think a lot of these ideas tend to come from a few different studies out there that have looked at a low-fat vegan diet for cardiovascular health or type 2 diabetes, for example. You'll be very familiar with those. What do you think about that idea? Is there any truth to that?
I don't. The question is whether it's the ideal diet, like the ideal diet, a low-fat vegan diet.
The ideal or optimal way to do a vegan diet is low-fat.
Okay. So this is how I entered this field. I worked for PCRM. That's how, as I said, that's how I first became vegan. And PCRM did then and continues to promote a very low-fat diet. And that was my introduction to veganism. And I believed that it was true, and I ate that way. Counted, just didn't eat any oils and hardly any nuts at all. I tried to eat all starches and all high carb foods. Then I started reading the research about heart disease and fat, and of course came to realize that fat is good for lowering LDL cholesterol. That unsaturated fats are great in this regard, and that very high fat diets may be associated with weight gain for some people, because they do push calorie intake up. So there can be, for some people, there might be a reason to curtail fat intake a little bit, but I don't know of any real evidence that limiting all types of fats is going to improve your health. And I think that it's a worse choice for heart disease. We know that that the essential fatty acids that are found in plants are important in helping to treat and prevent heart disease. Polyunsaturated fats are great.
So why do you think, because I agree with you, I think that's, if you look across the broad body of literature, it seems very clear that polyunsaturated fats, particularly those coming through foods like nuts and seeds, but even some oils, which I think we're going to get to, can be very beneficial for heart health. But why do you think there is this segment within the vegan community that is maintaining this position, and that's been maintained for quite a few decades now, that no, in fact, the best outcomes are achieved by lowering total fat and having just an overall low-fat diet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it's primarily about weight loss. I think that when you greatly reduce the amount of fat in the diet, many people will experience weight loss. And when you make a diet very restrictive, when you're eliminating lots and lots of categories of foods, and when you are eating a vegan diet and then cutting out even more categories of foods, you're getting into some pretty restricted eating. And people who eat very monotonous, restricted diets do tend to have more success in losing weight. Weight loss is usually accompanied by drop in blood pressure, and that's associated with better heart health. There's some of the studies that have looked at reversal of atherosclerosis, and I don't know whether I know that there are lots of questions about whether that's actually true, about whether it was actually reversed. But either way, one school of thought is that it has nothing to do with the amount of fat in the diet. It has nothing to do with whether it's a vegan diet. It has to do whether people lose weight and lower their blood pressure, and that any reversal in atherosclerosis is due to that reduction in blood pressure. Right. So I think that this is just, I think it is just a really easy way to restrict the diet in a way that maximizes the chances that people are going to lose weight, and therefore they're going to, see these other health benefits.
So if someone is, let's say, eating a diet that is a low-fat plant-based diet, do you think that the addition of, say, some extra fats coming through nuts and seeds and potentially olive oil, do you think that improves their overall diet quality?
Oh, I think it does. I think, because we know about the health benefits of these polyunsaturated fats, I think that it definitely improves the quality of the diet and increases the chances that you'll lower your LDL cholesterol.
Mm-hmm. And just for the listeners who may be wondering what you were talking about there with regards to reversal, I think that just to put some context there, there's some questions around, was true reversal achieved? But with, regardless of that, there are studies showing improved health outcomes, which really is what matters most. So it's not necessarily questioning those studies and saying they're kind of completely invalid or anything like that. Right. There's some technical things to be clarified around whether by definition you can say reversal. Right. So that's where the kind of questions kind of remain there. Cool. So that's number 9. One last question I do have on fat is, what about the almost flip side? So how do you feel about someone who perhaps feels better on a higher fat vegan diet with less grains, for example? Is that also a potential option for someone?
I think it's a potential option. And I should say that even though I think that adding a little bit of fat to a very low fat diet is a good thing to do, if somebody has great health on a very low fat diet and they like eating that way and it's working for them, that's fine with me. I'm definitely not saying that people should not eat that way. I just don't think it's the ideal recommendation for everyone. And I feel the same way about high fat diets. If somebody is eating that way and all of their health parameters are great and they are happy with their diet and they feel good and they like their food and they love being vegan on their high fat diet, I think it's great. I have no problems with that whatsoever. But again, it's not something that I would recommend across the board. I recommend in terms of nutrients, a little bit of moderation among
Sure.
all three of the nutrients.
Right. And I guess the biggest take-home message here being that we shouldn't demonize all fats collectively. There are different types. There are some that sure we want to reduce our exposure to, but then there are others where the science suggests that their inclusion can be a health-promoting one.
Right.
So moving on to number 10, and I think we've sort of touched on this, but I'll throw it out to you and you can add anything if you feel it's necessary. Healthy vegan diets should include only whole foods.
So we have touched on it a little bit because, of course, if you're talking about a diet that includes only whole foods, that means that it's not including oils, of course, and that's the big one. It's not including any of the veggie meats. And from there, I think we get into some philosophical stuff because there are many different schools of whole food plant-based diets. There are some people who will say that you shouldn't be eating too much whole grain bread. That's the components of the food are broken down too much, and it's not really a whole food. So we can get into some real restrictions here. And I don't think that again, I don't think there's any reason why anyone needs to eliminate all of those foods from their diet. I don't know of any evidence that vegans who eat none of those foods are healthier than vegans who include some of those foods in their diets. If you're, if all of your food is fried in oil, if you're just eating like veggie meats fried in oil all day long, that's probably not great. Mm-hmm. But there's a space in between here where you can add some of these more processed foods to your diet, add some oils to your diet. Added fats can improve nutrient absorption. They make food taste good. One school of thought is that the reason that olive oil gets all this credit for being so great in the Mediterranean diet, maybe it's just because it makes vegetables taste so good that people eat more of them. Some of these more processed foods, like even breakfast cereals, for families that are raising kids on a vegan diet, they can be lifesavers. They can really help kids meet calorie needs and meet nutrient needs. So I think we need to maintain some space for these different kinds of dietary needs, these different approaches to eating, and recognize that none of these particular patterns has a monopoly on health. None of them have been shown to be the one and only good way to eat.
Hey friends, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. A quick message from one of our sponsors who makes this show possible, and then we'll jump straight back into things. If you're familiar with my nutrition philosophy, you will know that I'm a huge believer in plant-rich diets being better for people and our planet. You'll also know that I frequently draw attention to what I describe as nutrients of focus. These are nutrients that science shows plant-based eaters, whether plant predominant or exclusive, can fall short in, which can leave you feeling run down, lacking energy, experiencing brain fog, and generally just not as vital as you'd like to be. For that reason, together with a meal, a plant-based health and wellness company, I formulated Essential 8. Essential 8 is your one-stop multi-nutrient, formulated with DHA, EPA, omega-3s from algae oil, vitamin B12, iodine, vitamin D3, iron, zinc, selenium, and calcium to perfectly complement your plant-rich diet. I personally take Essential 8 every morning with breakfast, just 2 capsules, much easier than supplementing with these 8 key nutrients individually. What's even more convenient is I have a monthly subscription, so it turns up automatically on my doorstep and I never miss a beat. To get yours, head to theproof.com/friends. That's theproof.com/friends, where you'll find a link to purchase Essential 8 that will get you an extra 5% off your first order on top of the significant subscription discount. There will also be a link to this in the show notes. Okay, back to the show. Why do you think that there is, I guess, some stigma associated with, some of these more processed foods and almost a kind of purity approach to a whole food plant-based diet? Where do you think that comes from?
I think that there's a little bit of a false dichotomy here between people who eat a plant-based diet for health versus people who eat a plant-based diet for animals, and the ones who do it for animals are junk food vegans. And so they're, creating this bad image for veganism. They're not healthy, they're not thin, and so that, that's not good for veganism. And they're just, they're not doing veganism right. And that's certainly a false dichotomy because it's not two extremes like that. Again, there are people who are just having a treat and and an easy processed food every day and not eating junk all day long. So, but I think people become very attached to their way of eating, and especially when they believe that it's the one and only way to eat healthfully. It can be very difficult to hear that I think I said this before, that's not true, that there are other ways of eating that are okay too. And so I think that it becomes just easier to attach some stigma to that other way of eating.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing to kind of think about. Have you come across any sort of data that's looked at the willingness to, say, include fortified foods and supplements within a vegan diet, and whether there's a difference between someone who is motivated to adopt a plant-based diet for health reasons versus ethical reasons? Because there could be an argument made that a larger percentage of people coming from a health point of view may be less inclined to use supplements because they are coming from that kind of purity sort of angle.
I feel like I have seen something. There's a whole lot of research that's been published in the journal Appetite, if you're familiar with that, that has looked at beliefs and habits of vegetarians and vegans, often young women. And they've looked at some of the differences between those who are motivated by health and those who are motivated by animal rights or animal protection. And I kind of think that they have looked at this issue, but I can't quite put my brain cells on it. Okay. I can't remember for sure. But I think it's out there. Little pieces of research I think are out there, and I think that they reflect exactly what you would expect.
Okay, well we can maybe do some homework and throw it up on Twitter for those that are interested. Okay, so number 11 is really a follow-on, and you mentioned oils there. There is this idea out there that all oils are unhealthy, that we really need to adopt an oil-free diet if we want to achieve optimal health, and that any oils will raise the risk for heart disease. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's I think that the rationale for this is kind of a two-pronged approach. One is that oils are high in fat, and so they can't play a role in a low-fat diet. And the other is that they're a processed food, and therefore they can't play a role in a whole foods diet. And we hear all the time that oils are 100% fat, and my response to that is always, well, yeah. So what does that mean? Why is that a bad thing? I can't. You would have to show me that eating a food that's 100% fat has some kind of health repercussions. Oils, certainly some oils are very high in saturated fat, And those are oils, and tropical oils, for example, are oils that we want to minimize in the diet, even in vegan diets, even though vegans typically have low saturated fat intake. But these other oils, these oils that are high in polyunsaturated fats or high in monounsaturated fats, they are providing fatty acids that we know are good for health. And we don't have research to suggest that people who cook with these oils have poorer health than people who don't use them. That research just is not there. Mm-hmm. And there's no reason, there's no mechanism for it. There's no reason to believe that people who are including oils in their diet would have poorer health. So it's not, again, I think again, it's this idea of making diets very restrictive, basing diets on some very specific rules to make it more likely that people will lose weight, that they'll lower blood pressure, that they'll have some of these health outcomes.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate because I know what some people might be thinking here. They might be thinking, but Ginny, wouldn't you be better off getting fats from olives rather than olive oil? Or wouldn't you be better off getting your fats from avocado rather than avocado oil? And I'm sure you've heard that a lot. Mm-hmm. What would your thinking or response to that be?
Well, my response to that is that so first of all, my response to that is no to the olives, because the olives are high in mm-hmm. salt, they're high in sodium. So I love olives, but they're not any healthier for you than olive oil. Avocados and nuts and seeds, all things considered, they are healthier foods than the oils that are made from these foods. However, it's really difficult to saute onions in avocados and in chopped nuts. I mean, oils have culinary purposes that enhance our enjoyment of food. Mm-hmm. And they do it in ways that are not harmful to our health. So yes, I think it's really great if you're sitting down and you have a choice between chopping an avocado on top of your salad or putting some oil on top of your salad, and you're happy with either one, then yeah, go with the avocado. But if you really like to have a vinaigrette on your salad, it's not going to hurt you. And if you enjoy that, there's no reason not to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. The practicality and helping people find a way of eating that they can adhere to and enjoy is an important part of this conversation here.
It's an important part of health, and right. And it's an important part of our vegan advocacy. We want people to know that there is a vegan way of eating for everyone, and you don't have to eat this one restricted kind of diet. You don't have to follow this one set of rules. There are other ways that you can eat if that's what you enjoy.
Yeah, that's interesting in itself. This idea that there is not one prescription and that you can adapt to this way of eating in the way that works best for you. Some people are looking for that set single prescription and the silver bullet, but I think the great thing about what you're explaining here is this means that there's a lot of choice and you can play around and really find something that works for you. The other thing that I think is interesting when you start to compare, say, avocado to avocado oil and other nuts to nut oils and what's healthier and you play this game on paper, is you can get into this trap of, if we were always to compare every food and determine what's the healthiest out of those, we'd end up with really only a few foods on our plate and we lose all of that variety, right? We're left with nothing. So we have to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Number 12, a raw foods diet is the optimal vegan diet. So this is a bit of a similar claim to a low-fat plant-based diet being the optimal vegan diet, which we've covered, often comes from a slightly different part of the community. How do you feel about a raw food diet being the optimal vegan diet? Is there any evidence for that? And if someone's come across that, what would you like them to be thinking about?
Yeah, it's interesting because I often hear a raw food diet described as a way to take your veganism to the next level. You can always make your vegan diet a little bit cleaner. You can always make it a little bit more healthy. That's the message that I hear when I hear people talking about going raw, when they started out as vegan in particular. And raw fruits and vegetables are great. It's good to include some of those in your diet. That of course is not what people are talking about when they're talking about raw foods diets. There's not that much research on raw foods diets, so to be fair, if they have any great advantages, we probably just don't know about them because we haven't seen them. But I can't think of why there would be any particular health advantage to eating a raw foods diet. We know that there are some disadvantages. We know, for example, that they're not recommended for children. And that raises a red flag for me. If a diet is not good enough to support people during the growth years, is it really something that we want to recommend? Mm-hmm. It can be very laborious. It can really take a lot of time. It can be very time consuming. Take a lot of time in the kitchen to prepare raw foods, and I kind of worry a little bit about what kind of an image that presents for veganism. Mm-hmm. If people think that eating the healthiest vegan diet is a diet that demands that you put a lot of time into cooking, and that you follow some very specific rules about the way to eat. So from both a health perspective and an advocacy perspective, I don't think it's a good idea to recommend a raw foods diet. And we do, we see some nutrient issues with zinc and calcium and bone health. So there are real concerns about it. So no, I don't recommend a raw foods diet.
I'm assuming that within this kind of message, there is a presumption that cooking negatively affects the nutritional properties of food. So is that something that you've researched? Should we be worried about heating plant foods and that having a negative effect on the nutrition available and what we'll be consuming? And if people are heating their food, is there any advantages over the method of heating?
Well, certainly some methods of cooking are healthier than others. Steaming is a great way to prepare vegetables if you want to maintain as much of the nutrient content as possible. Cooking can reduce nutrient content of foods, and especially if foods are boiled and cooked for a long time. But cooking can also enhance nutrient availability and make it easier to absorb those foods. Cooking and adding a little bit of fat is great for absorbing certain nutrients. So I don't think that I think that being careful about the way you cook fruits and vegetables is a good idea, and eating some raw fruits and vegetables is good. But I don't think that, for example, that you shouldn't cook beans, you should only sprout them. I don't see any real good rationale for that approach.
Okay. Let's talk about vitamin B12.
Okay.
One that comes up quite a lot, and there's a couple of different myths here. And the first one, I think, potentially goes back to this idea that humans are herbivores. But this one is that we can get vitamin B12 from seaweed or unwashed vegetables. And often I think mushrooms also come up here. How do you feel about that?
Well, there have been some studies, mostly by a single group of researchers from Japan. There have been some studies of vitamin B12 in certain sea vegetables, and they have claimed in their papers that they have isolated vitamin B12 from these sea vegetables, but they haven't been the compounds that they've isolated have not been tested to see whether they actually can treat a B12 deficiency, whether they actually have any whether they have any B12 activity. So we don't know whether they're B12 or whether they are inactive analogs. And that's always a problem with these foods, that they contain both active vitamin and vitamin B12 lookalikes that don't have any vitamin activity. So that has caused some confusion because that research has been published fairly recently, within the past couple of decades. And so it's sort of helped to promote this idea that you can get vitamin B12 from sea vegetables. And we just don't have good research to show that that's true. As far as we know, vitamin B12 is available to us only from animal products. And so if we're not eating animal products, we have to play it safe and take a B12 supplement or eat fortified foods. There's vitamin B12 in the dirt, but there's no evidence that just eating unwashed produce, which is a terrible idea anyway, to not wash your produce, and it probably is not going to have any effect on your vitamin B12 status. It's such a hard thing because B12, all of the anti-vegans, this is the thing that they hold up to us. If a vegan diet is so great, how can it be if it doesn't provide all nutrients if you have to add a supplement? And so, understandably, vegans desperately want to believe that we have some kind of plant or algae source of vitamin B12, but the evidence is just not there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's another one where it's difficult to accept. The intent is a good one in trying to find some sort of source of B12 out there and prove people wrong. But your advice is just to really just accept what the facts say and to plan accordingly to consume the fortified foods or a supplement.
Yeah, and I always point out to people, as you know, that we also recommend that everyone over the age of 50 takes a vitamin B12 supplement, because as you age, it becomes much more difficult to absorb vitamin B12 from animal foods because it's bound to protein. So older people probably can't get enough vitamin B12 unless they are eating fortified foods or taking supplements. And that doesn't mean that, turning 55 is unnatural. Aging is not a great thing, but that aging is a bad thing. We just have to accept this. We just have to accept that there are certain groups of people who have to take vitamin B12 supplements, and they are older people who are eating meat and all vegans.
So this brings us to number 14, which is more looking at the particulars of supplementation. And often there's sort of a little bit of a debate or argument between the best form of vitamin B12. So this one that we've got here is methylcobalamin is the best form of vitamin B12. Yeah.
And the reason, so it's not. The reason that people believe that is because it's a coenzyme form, and so it needs to go through fewer steps in the body before we can use it for vitamin B12. And so that's one reason that people want to use methylcobalamin. The other reason is that the supplement form that we recommend most often is cyanocobalamin, which has a cyanide molecule attached to it. And people don't want to be putting a whole lot of cyanide into their bodies. So that's one of the reasons that some doctors recommend avoiding cyanocobalamin and using methylcobalamin instead. The issue, so first of all, I think that cyanocobalamin is safe for most people. It's a very tiny amount of cyanide. It's way lower than what's considered to be a toxic or dangerous level. It doesn't even come close to it. So I don't think that's an issue. And the other thing is that we just have more research on it. We've just studied it more. And the little bit of research that we have on methylcobalamin suggests that it might be less stable in the vitamin. It might degrade a little bit more quickly, so that people end up needing much higher doses of it in order to meet vitamin B12 needs. And we don't have a good handle on how much people need if they're taking methylcobalamin. So it's not that it's bad. You can use it to meet vitamin B12 needs. You need to take pretty big doses. Cyanocobalamin is just a better choice.
That's a really important point, though, that most of the sort of recommendations for the B12 dosage that you'll see online and in books like yours are for cyanocobalamin. Yeah. And to just translate that microgram amount to methylcobalamin may actually not be the right amount of methylcobalamin that you require to absorb enough and to maintain good vitamin B12 status. So that's something else to kind of consider. What about if someone's thinking, well, I've read about MTHFR, gene mutations, and I've been told that methylcobalamin is actually better absorbed as a result of someone who perhaps has that gene mutation.
Well, I mean, for somebody that knows that they have that gene mutation, if they want to take methylcobalamin, I'm not going to argue with them about it. For the, excuse me, for those very specific circumstances. I mean, for people who smoke, it might be a better option. But for the general population, it's for an across the board kind of recommendation. I'm always going to recommend cyanocobalamin.
Right. And in terms of cyanocobalamin, I know there's a few different options that you recommend, but what's the sort of simplest way that you would recommend someone supplement with cyanocobalamin to achieve healthy B12 status?
I would say 25 micrograms a day is the easiest. The only thing that makes that not so easy is the fact that it's kind of difficult to find vitamin B12 pills that have that low a dose of cyanocobalamin. So most pills have much more than that, and so it might be easier for some people to just take 1,000 micrograms a couple times, 2 or 3 times a week.
And if someone's wondering, well, Ginny, the RDI is, I think in Australia, I think it's 2.4 micrograms. It might be a little different in the States and other countries, but why is that dose that you're recommending so much higher than what the RDI is?
Yeah, it's really an odd recommendation compared to the RDI or the RDA. The reason for that is that most people omnivores get their vitamin B12 throughout the day in small doses. And that's the way vitamin B12 is absorbed best, in small amounts. When you start to take it, when you start to consume it less often in larger amounts, your body absorbs proportionally less of it. It has to do with the way vitamin B12 is absorbed. It's absorbed in 2 different ways, and it attaches to those receptors in your body and saturates them, so you can only take in so much at a time. So we do some fancy math to come up with these numbers to show people how much they need to eat and how much they need to consume if they're only taking vitamin B12 once a day instead of getting it, from 3 meals and a snack. Or if they're only getting it 2 times a week. And on the Jack Norris's website, Vegan Health, has a very specific discussion of how we arrive at those numbers. It's more than most people want to know, but the information is there.
Right. No, I think it's a fabulous resource that is great to point out. I'll put that into the show notes too. I think everyone should get familiar with that website if you want to learn more about vitamin B12 or really just vegan diets in general. There's a huge amount of great information. It's always being updated as well. So I'll make sure I put that into the show notes. Just quickly, what about if someone's thinking, I am consuming fortified foods, so a plant-based milk that maybe contains B12, some nutritional yeast, maybe some other products. Is there anything that they need to be thinking about in terms of spacing those out over the day or the amount of those that they would need to consume?
Yeah, there is. We get very picky when we talk about vitamin B12. I don't like to give people too many rules and make them jump through too many hoops in order to meet nutrient needs. But when it comes to vitamin B12, we have to do that a little bit. If you're getting vitamin B12 from fortified foods, you need to eat at least 2 servings of those foods a day, and they should be consumed about 3 hours apart. Oh, that gives these receptors time to take the vitamin B12, absorb it, and open up again for the next dose of B12.
Okay, great.
So it's a little picky, but some people prefer to get vitamin B12 from fortified foods, and that's absolutely reasonable.
Yeah, certainly possible. If someone is wanting to understand their B12 status, so I guess the first question is, let's say you are supplementing routinely with that 25 micrograms or thereabouts daily, you feel fine. Is there a need to check your B12 status in the first place? And if for whatever reason someone did get a B12 test or really wanted to understand their B12 status, what would you recommend they're sort of thinking about or discussing with their doctor, or what types of tests would you like to see them have ordered?
Yeah, because depending on their diet and blood level of vitamin B12 may or may not reflect your actual vitamin B12 status. You really want to know more about functional. You want to have functional tests that tell you more about vitamin B12 activity in your body, like an MMA test. Mm-hmm. If you can get your doctor to delve into vitamin B12 a little bit more by doing some of these other tests, then that's a really good idea. My doctor's always very resistant to it. She says, "Well, you take a vitamin B12 supplement, right?" And I say, "Yeah." And so she doesn't want to do the test.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so MMA, and perhaps just to kind of really tie off on B12, what would be potential symptoms or signs for someone? Let's say someone has been eating a vegan diet for 5 years, 6 years, has not been supplementing, but has had some exposure to B12 through fortified foods, but just hasn't really been staying on top of it. What are the kind of signs or symptoms, things that they might experience that may be suggesting that their B12 is on the lower side?
Probably what would be the most obvious and the most likely would be symptoms associated with anemia. So fatigue would be a good indicator. Some people might experience some of the neurological symptoms before they even have anemia. So maybe a little bit of weakness in the extremities, some tingling. Interestingly, some of the conditions that we associate with aging, cognitive decline, hearing decline, balance issues, we're finding sometimes are actually vitamin B12 deficiency. Mm. So vitamin B12 affects both blood health and neurons. So there is a host of potential symptoms, but you would want to look for tingling, weakness, tiredness. Those would be good indicators of vitamin B12 deficiency.
Yeah, so not something that we want to experience. So fortunately, there's an easy way to cover this, and hopefully that's the take-home message here, is to find that supplementation or fortified food protocol and to just be cognizant of it. Once you've kind of set that up, the great thing is it's really just set and forget. It's not something that you have to keep worrying about on a daily basis. I certainly don't.
It's the easiest thing in the world, and I do understand the resistance to it, but it is so easy and so important.
Before we jump to number 15, are there any other nutrients that you would want to bring folks' attention to that you would like them to consider supplementing outside of vitamin B12?
Yeah, vitamin D, certainly. Unless people are absolutely certain that they're getting enough sun exposure. Now, you're in Australia.
I am.
So there's plenty of sun there. Of course, everyone is weighing the risk of skin cancer against sun exposure for vitamin D, and I am really a big fan of using sunscreen and taking a vitamin D supplement. And that is not a vegan issue. That is an issue for everyone eating every kind of diet.
Sure.
So vegans need to be concerned about that, but it's not a shortcoming of vegan diets. Some vegans might want to consider iodine. If they're not using iodized salt. Iodine is another nutrient that's kind of tricky because we don't really measure it, and we don't know how much is in the foods that we eat because the amount of iodine is so variable among foods, depends on where they're grown. Omnivores get iodine from seafood and from dairy products. So vegans don't have those two sources. We do have iodized salt. We have sea vegetables. I don't think that they are especially, like land vegetables, I don't think that they're especially reliable. So I don't like to see vegans depending on them. So an iodine supplement can be a good choice for some people.
Yeah, I used to throw out the sea vegetables as an option, but with more reading and discussions, it's something I'm kind of definitely moving away from. I think the supplementation is going to be a more reliable, consistent source for sure. So iodine, vitamin D3, and on vitamin D3, I think it's also worth just mentioning, I know here in Australia anyway, it's not, D3 supplements are not always vegan. So if you were looking for a vegan source, then you'd want to find a brand that sort of makes it clear on the label that they're sourcing their vitamin, either D3 from, I think, algae, or D2 comes from mushroom. Do you have any preference between the two of those? Would either of those be okay?
I think either one is okay. I tend to like vitamin D3, especially if somebody has low vitamin D levels. I think that vitamin D3 is possibly a little bit more effective in reversing those levels. I think if you have good vitamin D status, then probably vitamin D2 is good enough to maintain that.
Right.
But in the United States, vegan vitamin D3 is getting very easy to find. It used to be just, it used to not exist, and then for many years there was just one brand of it. But now we have quite a few. So if you can get that, I think it's a good choice.
And I apologize if I missed this, but just on D3 or D2 or D in general and iodine, what is there a ballpark sort of a daily dosage that you would be recommending for most people?
I recommend the RDA for vitamin D. Just 600 or 800 I use a day. For iodine, I don't think that you need to take the RDA. I think you want to take just a little bit as a little bit of insurance. So maybe, like 90 to 150 micrograms 2 or 3 times a week.
Right.
That will not meet the RDA, but it's going to give your iodine intake a little bit of a boost.
And I might be opening a can of worms here because this is probably more than a short answer, but where do you kind of land on EPA and DHA when we're thinking about omega-3s and the difference between, say, those and ALA, and whether someone that's not eating seafood or a direct source of DHA and EPA needs to supplement?
Yeah, I don't know. I just don't know. And I have changed my mind about this more times than I can remember. I don't know that the evidence for health benefits of DHA and EPA are overwhelmingly compelling, but there is some evidence there. And so I think that it's the kind of thing where I want to say, just take it as insurance, because it's not going to hurt you. So take it a few times a week, just in case it turns out that it really is important. The reason I have trouble saying that is that these supplements are really expensive, the vegan DHA and EPA, and I know that it's a burden for a lot of people to vitamin B12. I mean, that's just as cheap as could be. Same thing with vitamin D. But it could be a burden for a lot of people to take these other supplements. And so it's something that I would really like to be right about. I would really like to be able to tell people exactly what they should do with this, but I just can't. I take them a few times a week. I don't take anything close to what the major health organizations are recommending. My doses are less than that, simply because they are expensive. So I think that if you can afford it, it's a good thing to do. I think that if you can't, it's probably just don't sweat it, because we just don't know. Lots of people in the world don't eat fish,
right,
and have good health. I
think something that you said there that is refreshing, but I think people will appreciate, is I don't know. And this is one of those topics where it's not particularly clear and things might change, and there's a lot of different things to weigh up, and cost being one of those. I'd like to see, more research that helps us better understand. Particularly, I'd love to see a group of vegans with some that are supplementing and some that are not. This might be wishful thinking, and looking at longer term health outcomes. But that's going to take some study to kind of pull together.
I think it's. I'm always struck by the fact that in the epidemiological studies that health benefits in regard to heart disease in particular are not what we would expect to see in vegans. They're not as compelling as what we would expect to see. And so I am always wondering what is the reason for that? Why are we not seeing across the board and absolutely significantly that vegans have much lower risk for heart disease? We just don't see that consistently. And so what is the reason for that? Is it lack of DHA and EPA? Would all vegans be better off with those supplements? I just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, maybe we'll get some more research in future years that will help shed some light on that. And I mean, if that was the case, speaking of price and affordability and whatnot, it would be nice to see DHA and EPA perhaps used a little more through the food system. Mm-hmm. And in some of these, fortification, or I have seen some suggestions that there are certain plants that you can grow and do it in a certain way where you increase the DHA and EPA content in those plants. So there's some neat kind of, I guess, potential innovation from a public health point of view.
Yeah.
If the science is there to then say, okay, great, well, how do we actually make this something that is accessible?
Yeah.
Which of course is a whole nother conversation. Number 15, I love this one. A healthy, whole food, plant-based diet guarantees good health. People who eat this way don't require medication. And I'm going to say it, including statins.
The S word.
I know. I've just got myself in a lot of trouble on Twitter.
Oh, well, there's no diet, of course, that guarantees optimal health for everyone. There are certainly medical conditions, not just high LDL cholesterol, that people can do all of the so-called right things and are still going to need medication to get cholesterol, blood sugar, anything else where they're supposed to be. So it's and it's such an unfortunate belief, because yes, we can do so much good stuff through diet. We can really treat a lot of conditions and help people to be healthier simply through diet changes. There's no doubt about that. But this belief that it's all powerful and that people who do all of the right things will never have to take medication, it shames people so much when they do have to take medication. And that's just not fair. I mean, whatever you need to do to get your health where you want it to be is what you should do. And that includes taking statins.
And this idea of, I guess, vegan diet or whole food plant-based diet guaranteeing good health, was that the inspiration behind your book, Even Vegans Die?
Yeah, it was. We wrote that book primarily. That was with Carol J. Adams and Patty Brightman, and we wrote that book to address some of the shame that people felt around being sick, being vegan and being sick, and especially having a higher body weight and being vegan. We talked to a lot of people. I solicited a lot of stories through my blog, through my website, and they were just heartbreaking. How many people are vegan for the animals and they are afraid to go out and advocate for animals, afraid to speak up about their veganism because they're fat or they have diabetes, and they feel like they're not a good poster child for veganism. They feel like they don't have the right to speak out on behalf of animals. And so we heard those stories and we wanted to address that and say, look, veganism is not a guarantee that you're going to be healthy. It's not a guarantee that you're going to be thin, and it's not a guarantee that you're not going to die. Even vegans die. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was the inspiration for that.
Okay. Well, that's another one that people can put on their reading list.
It's my favorite book that I've written.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll put that in the show notes. The last myth that we have, and I think this almost ties back to dairy, because I often see this come up. You mentioned that we just don't have the evidence when it comes to dairy, or that there's conflicting evidence. This myth is that industry-funded research should never be trusted. And when I say I often see this with dairy. Often when speaking about the evidence that we do have on dairy, I'm certainly met with, well, most of the research is funded by the dairy industry, so what do you expect? So talk to me about industry-funded research and whether it should, never be trusted.
Yeah. It's, always, I think that with any kind of research, you have to look at the study design and the way the conclusions are, the way the discussion and the conclusions are stated. And if it's a good study and the results are stated fairly, then it doesn't matter who paid for that study. And it's just we can't dismiss good findings and important findings just because of who paid for them. The other issue is that there's bias in all kinds of research. A researcher who has built their career around a particular theory, a particular hypothesis, is going to be biased when they do research on that particular subject. People who are doing research on plant-based diets, who are animal advocates, there's a whole bunch of research on the benefits of vegan diets that have come from people who are very pro-vegan diet because they're animal rights activists, and there's a strong bias with that. So we have to be really careful about this idea of bias. I think that almost everyone brings some bias to, almost all researchers bring some bias to the research that they're doing, and so we have to trust that they're good researchers who are going to design a study well and report the findings fairly. And if they don't, you can usually tell. Somebody who knows how to read the literature is usually going to be able to tell if that's not true.
Right. So you mentioned earlier that you started, or earlier in your career, you were working with PCRM. So if we were to kind of, I don't want to incite an argument at all, but I definitely hear from people online that PCRM are biased and they are producing studies to simply help support the belief that animal food should not be eaten and protect animals. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I want to say that yes, there is truth to that, but that it's not necessarily a bad thing. When I talk about the fact that many researchers come to these topics with some kind of a bias, it doesn't mean that their research is bad. It just means that there is the potential for that bias, and that can certainly be true with PCRM. I mean, their studies, they do good studies. Their research is good. I do think that they have a pro-vegan bias. The organization is animal rights is a part of what they do. So I think that we would want to look at them with as much skepticism as we look at research that is funded by the dairy industry. But it doesn't mean that any of that research is bad. Mm-hmm. It just means that we want to bring the same level of skepticism to all of these researchers.
Right. Do you think that for like the general public, when they learn that PCRM or just other organizations similar to that are motivated by the ethics, they lose trust in the health information that they're providing? Or they question, they second guess it?
Yes. I think that may be true for many people. I think that's why transparency is so important. I think just like being really upfront about the things that are driving what you do makes it easier for people to believe what you're saying.
Of all of these myths that we've covered, and we went through about 16, and I certainly don't expect you to remember all of them, but if you just think about misinformation and myths in general and those that you've come across during your career, written about, spoken about, tried to clarify, which are the ones or the one that you think represents the greatest risk to health outcomes for vegans?
I think probably in terms of the one that has the potential to do the greatest harm, it would be this idea that simply eating a wide variety of foods will ensure that that all nutrient needs are met. And then a close cousin to that, of course, is this idea that we don't need to take any supplements, that we don't need vitamin B12 supplements. I think that those two certainly have the potential to harm vegans, to encourage vegans to make poor food choices and end up with a nutrient deficiency or just not feeling well. And that has potential to harm health, personal health, which of course is a bad thing, and to turn people away from veganism, which is also a bad thing.
Now, we've kind of spoken about this, but in terms of trying to help correct some of this misinformation and reduce it, of course, education, everything you're doing is a hugely important part of that. But let's talk about the folks that are listening. Perhaps they're on social media and they stumble across some information online and they sort of take it at face value and then they share it with good intentions, because I think that can happen too.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's not just the initial creation of the information, but then it's the social sharing, which really just adds fuel to the fire. So I'm kind of interested here as we come to the end of this, if you have any tips, what do you think people can do when they come across a piece of information online that might help them sort of put it through a filter or help them determine if it's good information and it's actually worth sharing with their friends and family or not?
It's so hard. I think that the only thing that you can do is to check it against reliable resources, like Vegan Health and the Vegetarian Resource Group. I think my website has evidence-based nutrition information on it, and I think that the Vegetarian Nutrition Dietetic Practice Group has fact sheets with good information. So I think it's a little bit laborious, but I think that checking this information against reliable resources is the best thing that you can do, because it's so hard to know. I see it as soon as I start, kind of tiptoeing out of my own area of expertise into something like the environment, which I have, has a big connection to diet, but it's not my area of expertise. And even the idea of humans being being natural herbivores, that's kind of, some evolution and physiology that's kind of outside of my area of expertise. So as soon as I start reading about those things, I find that I can be caught up in things that may be questionable, and I need to be really careful. So it's very difficult to know. There's so much misinformation out there. There's so much junk science and so much noise that you just have to stick with the reliable resources.
Yeah, that's a good point, that we're all susceptible to this. And have you ever done a blog on the reliable resources and some of those different resources that you recommend?
I have, yeah.
Okay.
I'd be happy to share that with you.
Yeah, we'll put that into the show notes.
Okay.
Ginny, this has been incredibly informative. Is there anything that you feel like we missed that perhaps you wanted to add or mention here at the end, or do you think we covered everything that you wanted to?
Oh, we probably didn't cover everything. There are a lot of myths, but boy, we covered 15 of them. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Nothing comes to mind. I think that we hit on the really important things. We hit on the things that tend to come up over and over again on social media.
We can leave some space for a part 2 continuation. And if there are any other myths or claims online that you're not sure about, perhaps you can send them in to myself or Ginny, and we can use those as a way of extending this episode into the future. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know that it's going to be incredibly helpful for the listeners. I know that people are going to share it far and wide with their family. Can you just remind listeners what's the best place for them to find you online, and some information about your website and the books for those that are wanting to learn more.
Yeah, so I'm my website is theveganrd.com, and that is also my Twitter and Facebook name, the Vegan RD. And I'm Ginny Messina on Instagram, because I post lots of pictures of my cats in my garden. So I much more diverse, much more of my life. And my books are Vegan for Life, Even Vegans Die, Never Too Late to Go Vegan for older people, for people over 50 who want to dabble in a vegan diet.
And did you also write Vegan for Her? Is that another one?
I did write Vegan for Her, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So that's another one. All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Ginny.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining me for this episode and your interest in science-based conversation. I hope you enjoyed it and found the information covered interesting and instructive. If you did and you'd like to show your support for the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can stay up to date with new episodes and watch them in video format. Yes, the full-length videos. Please also consider subscribing to the show on the Spotify and/or Apple Podcast app, wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. You can also leave a review on Apple or Spotify. Again, a great way to support the show and make our content more discoverable for others to enjoy and learn from. If you have any comments about the episodes, suggestions for future episodes, including guests you'd like to see on the show, or questions that you'd like to have answered, please leave those in the comments section on YouTube. I myself and my team will take note of these comments when planning future episodes. Finally, the best way to support the show and receive discounts on products we love is by checking out our sponsors at theproof.com/friends. Enjoy your week, stay well, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.